It's a great pleasure now to be in conversation with Dr. Njeri Mwagiru. She's a senior futurist at the Institute for Futures Research at the University of Stellenbosch. Thank you very much for joining us. So I think the question that pops up into somebody's mind when you hear senior futurist, you're like, what does a senior futurist do? What are we talking about essentially?
Thank you so much for having me, and that's a great question that I do get asked quite frequently. So a senior futurist studies the future. And I'm not talking about futures in terms of the financial instruments and equities. We're talking about futures in terms of time frames, years, centuries, ages, era. And we track trends and try to understand how emerging contexts could bring about different types of futures depending on how those trends emerge. Mm-hmm. So a senior futurist aims to sense opportunities as well as anticipate risks so that we can take the right decisions and put in place the right policies and actions to drive towards the futures we want, better futures, and to navigate away from futures we don't want to realize.
Agenda 2063 talks about the Africa that we want to see. And when we talk about the future, we can't talk about it without talking about planning.
Absolutely.
And if you fail to plan, you fail, or what's the saying? Something about failing to plan leading to failure, essentially.
Yes, if you fail to plan, then you're planning to fail.
There we go.
Yeah.
Are we really serious about where we see ourselves in the future? What are our plans for the future?
I think the Agenda 2063 document is a very good document for the continent. And having this vision to guide us is visionary for Africans to think 40 years from our current years, so 40 years from where we stand now, and 100 years from the establishment of the Organization of African Unity. So I just want to acknowledge that having the vision in the first place is excellent. In terms of planning and implementation, I think we now need to see that Agenda 2063 document become much more concrete and influence our policy space and influence our implementation space so that it moves from being an abstract vision to being a lived reality. Yes.
You mentioned yesterday on the panel that you were on about the three scenarios that we see. So utopia, the swan, and dystopia. Let's unpack what you were saying essentially.
Yes, so I was discussing possible African governance futures into 2063. And scenarios are a story about the future. They tell a narrative about the future. And they're based on rigorous analysis of current data in order for us to anticipate what different futures might emerge. Usually scenarios try to paint a range of different options. And I decided to share from a dystopia perspective, which means the very worst outcomes we could possibly imagine. I also decided to share a utopia perspective, which is the very best outcomes we could imagine. And then the wild card or the black swan scenario discusses unexpected or surprise elements that might come to pass. And in terms of a dystopia of Africa, that would be an Africa that follows the Afro-pessimism narrative. So Africa's failing, we never get ourselves out of our development ruts, we're consistently dependent on others to assist us. That would be a dystopia where we don't realize Agenda 2063, we don't realize our vision. The utopia would be one where we realize our vision, and not only realize our vision, but have a vision that's agile, have a vision that is flexible and adapts itself to changing times. So the Agenda 2063 document should not be locked in concrete. It should be a document that can also grow with us and grow with our changing vision, our changing capabilities and capacities. So a utopia would be one where we realize the vision of Agenda 2063, and that vision is relevant for those future African societies. And then the wild card that I decided to discuss is where there's a complete change to the context. And I think the possibility of the state system changing. We've had a lot of discussion around the relevance of the Westphalian state for an African context. And I think this discussion could possibly pick up momentum, and it could lead to some changes around the state as an entity.
You know, for a young person right now, the future is sort of today, and a lot of them would tend to lead onto the dystopia. We see young people making perilous journeys outside of their continents, even within the continent, people who will walk for, days in order to get to a different country just to get refuge. What do we do today for the future that we want?
I think your question captures futures perfectly, because the future technically doesn't exist. The future is what we will create and make by our actions today. And if we reflect on how the youth are engaging with their potential, I think the fact that they take perilous journeys and take huge risks is twofold. On the one hand, it's extremely disappointing because it means that there isn't a context to absorb that energy, that innovation, that adventurous spirit that would take those risks. On the other hand, I think there's an element of hope, and it might sound controversial, but these are African youth taking their futures into their own hand, maybe not necessarily making the right decisions, but certainly taking actions to change their conditions. And I think it's important for us to appreciate that energy, to appreciate that initiative, and we need to engage it in a more positive way so that we can take action today to build futures that would harness our potential in a more positive way.
When you look at the utopia, you find people who say, you know, I am going to contribute towards the Africa that I want to see. I may not see it in my lifetime. I may not see it in in my children's lifetime or their grandchildren. Are we being realistic about where we're going? Or what we could potentially see?
Yes. First and foremost, I think we do need to have more of a mindset shift towards that kind of an engagement with the future. So we're no longer dealing with short-termism. And we have a lot of short-termism in our African context, where we're living only for today or for immediate gratification. And we need to think long-term. I need to be able to act even if I know the benefits will not be for me. They might come in next generations, as you mentioned. So in terms of being realistic, I would say we need to see a stronger shift towards a responsibility for the future and towards an advocacy for the future. So we shift from looking to benefit only today and think about how can we benefit from the long term. And I think that's how we will realize the utopia.
How do we shift those mindsets?
Let's start talking.
Right.
Yes, I think we need to have many more platforms to engage, and not just to engage the issues we continuously engage with, but to engage more creatively, more imaginatively, to go into the more edgy spaces, the more what we would call controversial issues. Because I think in those spaces is where you might find the nuggets of wisdom that could be the shift that we need, that could bring us that mindset shift. So I think engagement is a starting point, and then willingness to engage openly and frankly with one another.
And platforms like the African Peer Review Mechanism, how important do you think they are in all of these processes and what we want to achieve ultimately?
I think platforms like the APRM are extremely important because they offer us an organizational context that allows us to drive the agenda forward. And if we're going to move away from having continuous talk shops, then we need to have structures that will help us implement. And I think the APRM as a sort of advisory peer review body can guide some of these processes and help us shape our institutions and structures in ways that will help us realize those futures. Having said that, I feel that the APRM also has room to grow in order to be not only, I think it's extremely relevant, but to have more impacts and to have more weights, and perhaps I might use the word authority. Yeah.
In closing up the conversation, your message to the everyday African, what would you like to say to somebody that perhaps is in a village somewhere, to a woman who is working so hard to school her children, to prepare them for the future on this continent?
My message would be that the future is ours to create. And we must hold on to that agency because we have it. And the way we create it is engaging positively every day with the opportunities that we have and being open to the lessons that will gear us towards our capacities. So not being afraid to fail in our learnings, but being willing to fail and pick ourselves up again and to see the future. A lot of the times when we speak about African populations and the future, we get the response that most Africans can't even meet their day-to-day subsistence needs. How are you going to talk to them about futures? But the point is, if we have a vision for the future, and if we have that long-term goal that can pull us forward, then the daily subsistence needs would be taken up into another context that propels us forward.
And with that, a big thank you to you, Dr. Njeri Mwagiru. It's been such a pleasure chatting to you. And she's a senior futurist with the Institute for Future Studies at the University of Stellenbosch.
Thank you.